Henry wasn't looking for a loophole. He was looking for land he could actually afford. He'd been searching for 8 months, running numbers on new builds that didn't add up, watching prices on raw acreage climb faster than anything he could save, talking contractors who quoted him figures that assumed he had access to money he didn't have and patience he was running out of. He was 41 years old. He'd spent 15 years building things in the Alaskan interior for other people, and the one thing he couldn't seem to do was build anything for himself. Then he saw the listing. 50-year-old Quonset hut, 47 acres. Off-grid, the asking price looked like a misprint. He read it 3 times. He'd been on his way to look at a newer cabin 20 miles north. Fresh foundation, double pane glass, a price tag that made his stomach clench every time he thought about the mortgage. When he pulled onto the shoulder instead. -12 outside. Engine running. He got out of the truck and stood there in the cold looking at a corrugated steel arch that was half buried in snow and half hidden by spruce trees, and something shifted in him that he couldn't quite name. He felt like he was looking at the right thing. That instinct, it turned out, was not accidental. It was a product of 15 years of watching how things held up, or didn't, in one of the most structurally punishing environments on Earth. Henry knew construction. He knew what rot smelled like behind a finished wall. He knew what permafrost he did to a foundation poured by someone who didn't understand the ground. He knew the difference between a building that looked solid and a building that was solid. And standing on that highway shoulder, he was starting to understand that he'd been looking in completely the wrong category this entire time. Here's what almost nobody tells you when you're shopping for a property in remote Alaska. The newest thing is rarely the best thing. The market has been conditioned by contractors, by lenders, by everyone who profits from new construction, to treat age as a liability and newness as a virtue. And in most contexts, that's reasonable enough. But in Alaska's interior, where the environment tests every material and every design decision every single year without mercy, age is not a liability. Age that hasn't killed a structure yet is the closest thing to a guarantee you will ever get. A 50-year-old Quonset hut that is still standing has passed every test. 50 consecutive winters. 50 cycles of freeze and thaw. 50 years of snow loading on that roof, of moisture looking for a way in, of permafrost moving beneath the foundation. If any of those tests had exposed a fundamental weakness in the design or the execution, the building would not be standing. The fact that it is standing is data. It is the most reliable data available. That's the pre-screened loophole. Not a legal trick. Not a technicality. A structural reality that the market has collectively decided not to think about, because the market is oriented towards selling new things, and new things cannot offer proof. They can only offer promises. Henry drove down the access road. The gate was open. In Alaska, that's an invitation, or close enough. The building was bigger than the road suggested. The Quonset core, the original military surplus half-cylinder of corrugated steel, was roughly 40 feet long and 22 feet wide. At the north end, a previous owner had added a gable frame addition that extended the living space considerably. The addition was rougher work than the original. Mismatched window trim, a roof line that didn't quite harmonize with the arch. But the materials were sound and the bones were honest, and Henry had learned long ago to trust honest bones over polished surfaces. He walked around it twice before he tried the door. What he saw during those 2 circuits mattered more than anything he would see inside. The foundation was pier and beam, a grid of treated posts set into the permafrost with the floor elevated roughly 18 inches off the ground. If you don't know why that matters, here's why it matters. A heated building sitting directly on permafrost is a slow-motion disaster. The heat migrates downward to the foundation, thaws the frozen ground beneath, and the soil loses its load-bearing capacity. The building begins to settle unevenly. Doors stop closing. Walls crack. Floors tilt. The whole thing becomes expensive to fix and eventually unfixable. The elevated pier and beam foundation prevents this entirely. Cold air circulates freely beneath the floor. The permafrost stays frozen. The building stays level. Whoever built this place understood the ground they were building on, and they built accordingly. Those piers had been standing for 50 years. Henry had seen brand new cabins, 5 years old, 8 years old, already showing the doorframe distortion and floor slope that meant the foundation was failing. He'd seen six-figure construction projects start at a list because a contractor from outside had applied standard lower 48 methods to Alaskan ground, and nobody had caught the mistake until it was too late. And here was this half-century-old Quonset sitting perfectly level on its original posts, absolutely indifferent to the opinion of anyone who thought old meant bad. He tried the door. Inside, the air was cold but was dry, genuinely dry. That distinction matters more than almost anything else in a structure, because moisture is what kills buildings. Moisture gets into wood, and it doesn't leave. It feeds mold. It rots framing. It destroys insulation. A cold building can be heated. A wet building is dying, and the dying is usually invisible until it's too late to stop. The interior of the Quonset portion showed the work of someone who had understood this. The steel ribs had been spray foamed at every seam and then covered with rough-cut pine boards that had aged over the decades to a color somewhere between honey and amber. The floor was wide plank spruce, gapped from the seasonal movement of the wood, but solid and completely unrotted. A cast-iron wood stove occupied the center of the curved space, its stovepipe running cleanly through a properly flashed collar in the ceiling. There was a stack of split birch beside the stove. Henry picked up a piece and tested it. Seasoned hard. Someone had been here recently enough to leave fresh fuel. He stood in the middle of that curved room for a long time. His nearest neighbor turned out to be a man named Dale. Somewhere in the 60s, ran a trap line, had been supplying Reuben with firewood in the old man's final years. Dale showed up 3 days after Henry closed on the property. Snow machine idling in the clearing, sled loaded with split birch, and explained the situation without much preamble. He'd been bringing wood. He'd keep bringing wood if Henry wanted it. The price was fair. Henry said yes. Dale knew the history of the building the way that men who live in a place for decades know things. Not from documents, but from proximity. Reuben had bought the Quonset shell from a military surplus auction in the early 1970s. The government had been offloading these structures from decommissioned installations across the state, selling off the hulks of wartime infrastructure for a fraction of what it had cost to build them. Quonset huts had been built by the thousands during the war, designed to be erected quickly anywhere on Earth by anyone with basic tools, engineered to withstand whatever the environment threw at them and then withstand again. When the military was done with them, they went looking for new owners. Men like Reuben found them. What Dale helped Henry understand, what Henry came to understand over the course of that first winter, was why the design itself was so durable. There are no load-bearing walls in a Quonset hut. The arch is a structure. The continuous curve distributes every load, snow, wind, seismic, along the entire length of the form, with no single point of concentration and no single point of failure. The corrugated steel sheds water and snow without trapping it. There are no flat surfaces where ice dams form, no complex junctions where moisture collects and works its way in. The geometry of the thing is its own engineering solution, derived not from theory, but from the practical requirement of building structures that would survive in the Pacific, in the Aleutians, in conditions that destroy conventional buildings without particular effort. Henry had spent his career watching construction industry solve problems by adding complexity, more components, more systems, more things to maintain and replace, and eventually fail. The Quonset hut solved the same problems by removing complexity. The arch needed no maintenance beyond keeping the fasteners tight. The steel roof needed no painting, no shingling, no flashing beyond the penetrations for the stovepipe and the ventilation stack. The foundation needed nothing at all as long as the permafrost stayed frozen beneath it, which the design itself ensured. Embarrassingly simple, which was exactly why it had lasted. He spent that first winter not renovating, but learning. He tracked condensation patterns on cold mornings, mapping where the thermal bridges were in the wall assembly. He observed how snow behaved differently on the curved Quonset roof versus the gabled addition, how the arch shed it naturally while the flat-pitched section required active clearing. He identified the single-pane windows in the addition as a moisture problem, not just an energy problem, because the cold glass surface sat permanently below the interior dew point, and the condensation running down those panes was exactly what caused the drywall staining in the corner. He wrote all of it down in a notebook he kept on the kitchen shelf. When spring came, he started working. Salvaged double-pane windows from a Fairbanks operation replaced the single panes in the addition, Not new, but thermally far better, and cheap enough that the whole job didn't hurt. A proper vapor barrier went into the addition walls where none had existed, installed with care to avoid creating a new moisture trap in the process of fixing the old one. The water system got a rebuilt insulation jacket of rigid foam board and fitted plywood. The solar system, already intelligently laid out by the original owner, got a proper battery bank from refurbished lithium cells and a second ground mount array in the south clearing, built on a steel angle iron frame that Henry welded himself in a single afternoon. The upgraded system produced more than twice what he needed on a clear summer day. Battery capacity sufficient to cover 3 or 4 days of cloud cover without touching the reserve. He was not trying to rebuild the grid out there. That's a mistake he watched people make, trying to replicate suburban electrical expectations in a remote off-grid setting, which required industrial battery storage and enormous capital expenditure, and ultimately proved the point that you can take the suburb out of the suburbs, but you cannot make the wilderness into a suburb no matter how much money you spend. Henry had sat down with a legal pad early in the process and listed every actual use he had for electricity: LED lighting throughout the building, a laptop, a satellite communicator, a chest freezer he ran seasonally, a small water pump. That was the complete inventory. Everything else ran on wood, propane, or his own physical effort. The system he had could supply that list indefinitely. By the end of his first full year, the math looked like this. He had a warm, dry, structurally sound cabin on 47 acres of productive spruce forest with a clean creek on the eastern boundary. He had a reliable wood supply, an expanding garden in raised beds that had outperformed his first-year expectations in the long subarctic days, and a chest freezer full of moose from a bull he'd taken in September. He had no mortgage, no utility connection, and no utility bill, and a property tax assessment that had not been substantially revisited since Reuben bought the place in the 70s. That last point deserves its own moment. Old structures that predated the property assessment frameworks that Alaskan boroughs had adopted and updated through the 80s and 90s, sometimes exist in an administrative gap between what the assessors were designed to evaluate and what is actually on the ground. This is not fraud. It is not exploitation of a technicality. It is a genuine consequence of an assessment system built to process and value one category of property being asked to process a different category that it was not designed to handle. Reuben's Quonset had been carried on the books at a value derived from the original surplus purchase, adjusted for inflation, but never fully reassessed against the improvements or against the rising value of the surrounding land. Henry was not a tax attorney. He was careful to say so. But the number on his annual property tax statement was a number that most people, seeing it attached to 47 acres within a day's drive of the city, would have assumed was a mistake. He talked to others who had made similar moves, found them the way you find people in Alaska who have opted out of conventional systems, which is in feed stores and equipment shops and the back rooms of particular bars in Fairbanks and Wasilla. The pattern was consistent. The people who bought old Quonsets, old roadhouses, old military air structures of various kinds, and converted them into functioning homes were not doing it out of nostalgia. They were not doing it for aesthetic reasons. They were doing it because the underlying economics were fundamentally different from anything available in the new construction market, and not in a marginal way, in a category-changing way. Low acquisition cost, structural integrity demonstrably proven by time rather than promised by a warranty, maintenance requirements manageable by a competent individual without professional dependency, and a position relative to the assessment and permitting systems that had made new remote construction prohibitive, that those systems simply hadn't caught up with yet. Dale called it the pre-screen loophole. Henry suspected Dale had coined the term on the spot, specifically for him, possibly enjoying himself slightly in the process. But the concept was accurate regardless of the label. A building that had survived 50 Alaskan winters had been pre-screened by the most rigorous testing program ever devised, which was reality itself administered, without mercy over time. No inspector signs off on that. No warranty covers it. No engineering report predicts it. The building simply either survives or it doesn't, and the one that is still standing when you show up to look at it has already answered the question. New construction offers you promises. Old construction that is still standing offers you proof. Henry understood the difference between those two things at a level that 15 years in infrastructure had made visceral rather than theoretical. He had watched new things fail. He had watched old things persist. He knew which category he trusted, and he knew why he trusted it. And when he sat in his cabin during the second winter with the wood stove running and the temperature outside at -40 for the 11th consecutive day and the battery bank at 91% on a clear morning, he was not surprised by any of it. He had chosen deliberately, and the choice was performing exactly as he had expected. He was not romantic about it. Romanticism about remote living is a specific kind of problem. He had watched wrecked people who had arrived in the interior with philosophies instead of skill sets, and had discovered, reliably, in February, that the environment does not negotiate with philosophies. He maintained his systems with real attention. He tracked his costs carefully. He kept an emergency bag ready near the door, because a medical event or a fire could turn this kind of life into a catastrophe inside of hours, and the nearest help was far enough away that the difference between prepared and unprepared was not trivial. He was not pretending any of this was without difficulty. But on a late March morning in his second year, the days already noticeably longer, the snow began to show that faint blue undertone that meant the crystal structure was starting to change towards spring. Henry walked his property boundary for the first time since freeze-up. He moved through spruce forest that was his. He crossed the creek on a log bridge he had built himself. He climbed a low ridge on the eastern edge and looked south through the trees of the highway, a gray line in the distance, occasional glint of vehicles, moving through a world that was operating on entirely different terms than the one he was standing in. He could see the cabin from up there. The corrugated arch of the Quonset visible above the tree-line. A thin thread of smoke rising from the stovepipe into air that was completely still. He thought about the listing agent's voice on the phone 8 months earlier. The surprise in it. 8 months on the market. An estate. A building that nobody wanted. He started back down the ridge. The building had been waiting 50 years for someone who knew how to read it. Most people drove past the listing the same way they drove past the building itself. A rusted arch poking above the tree-line, half swallowed by trees, looking like something left behind rather than something that had endured. That was the loophole in plain sight, not hidden in a document, not buried in a regulation, just sitting there on 47 acres at a price that reflected the market's inability to value proof over promises. Henry had read it correctly. He had done the work, and now he was home.